It's 1350. You're a peasant in rural England. You were born on this land. Your father was born on this land. His father before him, same land, same lord, same rules. You don't own anything. You can't leave. You owe your lord 3 days of labor every single week just to keep a roof over your head. If you try to run, you get dragged back. This is just life. It has always been this way. And everyone, including you, assumes it always will be. Then the plague comes. And within 3 years, everything you thought was permanent starts to crack. To understand what the Black Death changed, you first need to understand what it was changing from. Medieval Europe ran on a system called feudalism. And at its core, feudalism was simple. Land was power. At the top, you had the king. He granted land to powerful nobles in exchange for military loyalty. Those nobles granted portions to lesser lords. And at the very bottom, doing all the actual work, were the peasants. Specifically serfs. Serfs were not slaves. But they weren't free either. They were bound to the land they worked. They couldn't move to another village without permission. They couldn't marry without their lord's approval. They paid rent. They paid taxes. And they owed their lord a fixed number of days of free labor. Every single week. And here's the key thing that made this whole system work. There were always more peasants than land to go around. Labor was cheap because there was so much of it. If one serf complained, a lord could simply replace him. Workers had no leverage. None. That was the world of 1346. By 1353, it would be unrecognizable. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors on board were sick, covered in black boils oozing blood and pus, burning with fever. Some already dead at their oars. Port authorities ordered the ships out immediately. It was too late. The disease, what we now call the bubonic plague, spread through flea bites, through the air, through contact with the sick. And it moved fast. Within months, it had swept through Italy. Within a year, France, Spain, Germany. By 1349, it reached England. By 1353, it had consumed nearly all of Europe. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. In just 6 years, somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population died. That's roughly 25 million people. In some cities, Florence, Paris, London, the death rate was even higher. Some towns simply ceased to exist. Mass graves were dug because there weren't enough living people to bury the dead one by one. The church, which was supposed to have answers, had nothing. Priests died just like everyone else. Some fled their own congregations. The institution that held medieval society together spiritually was visibly, publicly failing. People tried everything. Burning herbs. Flagellating themselves in public. Blaming and attacking Jewish communities in horrific and violent ways. Nothing worked. The plague did not care. By the time it began to slow, Europe was a different place. Not just emotionally. Structurally. Because the plague had done something no revolution ever had. It had made labor scarce. Think about what feudalism actually needed to survive. It needed peasants. Lots of them. Desperate enough to accept terrible conditions because there was simply no alternative. The plague eliminated that desperation overnight. Suddenly, lords looked out over their estates and saw empty fields. Half their workforce was dead. The harvest still needed to come in. Winter was still coming. And the peasants who had survived? They knew it. For the first time in centuries, workers could negotiate. Surviving peasants began demanding higher wages. They started moving between villages, offering their labor to whichever lord would pay the most. Lords, facing the choice between paying more or watching their crops rot, began to comply. In England, agricultural wages roughly doubled in the decades after the plague. In some regions, peasants started acquiring small plots of land. The rigid, immovable hierarchy of feudalism was becoming, for the first time, movable. And this terrified the ruling class. Because it wasn't just the economics. It was the idea. The idea that peasants had a choice. That they could say no. That the system wasn't natural or God-given, it was just a power arrangement. And power arrangements can shift. The nobility did not accept this quietly. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers. It was blunt. Wages were to be frozen at pre-plague levels. Peasants were forbidden from leaving their home village to seek better pay elsewhere. Lords were forbidden from offering higher wages to attract workers. France, Italy, and other kingdoms passed similar laws. But here's the problem. You can write any law you want. Enforcing it when half your sheriffs are also dead is another matter entirely. And when a peasant can walk 10 miles to the next village and earn twice as much, the law starts to feel pretty abstract. Enforcement was patchy. Resentment was not. For 30 years, tensions simmered. Peasants were told their wages were illegal. Their movement was illegal. And on top of all that, they were being taxed heavily to fund the ongoing war with France. A new poll tax was introduced, charged per head, hitting the poor far harder than the wealthy. It was too much. In the summer of 1381, peasants across England rose up in what became known as the Peasants' Revolt. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, who famously preached, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who is then the gentleman?" Tens of thousands marched on London. They burned tax records. They destroyed every document recording feudal obligation. They stormed the Tower of London. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury. The young King Richard II met them and made promises. Then, once Wat Tyler was killed at a negotiation meeting, the revolt collapsed. The ringleaders were executed. The promises were broken. On the surface, the establishment had won. But something had changed permanently. The ruling class had seen what was possible. And the economic reality on the ground, scarce labor, rising wages, didn't go away just because a revolt was crushed. Over the following century, feudalism in Western Europe quietly dissolved. Not in one dramatic moment, but piece by piece. Lords switched from demanding labor to accepting cash rents, easier to manage, less confrontational. Peasants slowly accumulated small landholdings. The rigid bonds of serfdom were replaced by tenant farming, then by wages. By the late 1400s, legal serfdom had effectively disappeared in England and much of Western Europe. And the ripples went far beyond the fields. Wealth, inherited by survivors, concentrated and funded the art, philosophy, and science of the Italian Renaissance. The Church's failure during the plague planted seeds of doubt that would eventually bloom into the Protestant Reformation. The commercial disruption helped build the foundations of a money-based economy. The first stirrings of what we'd eventually call capitalism. All of it tracing back to one catastrophe. One disease. One moment when the system ran out of the one thing it needed to keep going. Over the following century, feudalism in Western Europe quietly dissolved. Not in one dramatic moment, but piece by piece. Lords switched from demanding labor to accepting cash rents, easier to manage, less confrontational. Peasants slowly accumulated small landholdings. The rigid bonds of serfdom were replaced by tenant farming, then by wages. By the late 1400s, legal serfdom had effectively disappeared in England and much of Western Europe. And the ripples went far beyond the fields. Wealth, inherited by survivors, concentrated and funded the art, philosophy, and science of the Italian Renaissance. The Church's failure during the plague planted seeds of doubt that would eventually bloom into the Protestant Reformation. The commercial disruption helped build the foundations of a money-based economy. The first stirrings of what we'd eventually call capitalism. All of it tracing back to one catastrophe. One disease.